Hi, my name is Eva Steiner, and this is my project Psychotherapists Around the Globe. I am interviewing the psychotherapists around the world and asking them the same 8 questions. I am wondering how mental health profession is in their country. Today we are going to. Thank you for taking this time for doing this interview with me. Before we start, can you tell me a little bit about yourself?
Hello, my name is Juanita. I'm a clinical psychologist from Malaysia. I am currently working with children. I'm glad to have had the opportunity to practice among all the different demographics in Malaysia, including from all the way to children to elderly populations, as well as both on the eastern side as well as the western side of Malaysia. It's been really good to be working here. Yeah, I'm very excited to share more with you today.
Tell me a little bit about your culture. What is some holiday or tradition that your country celebrates? And if your culture would be an emotion, what emotion would it be?
Malaysia has a population of 33 million people. It's a vibrant and it's a super diverse country. So we have a rich cultural heritage and it's very multi-ethnic in nature. So in Malaysia, the major ethnic groups are the Malays, the Chinese, the Indians, as well as our indigenous population. And in terms of festivals, we tend to celebrate each other's festivals. So, like I mentioned, it's multi-ethnic, right? So we celebrate all the festivals of all the different ethnicities here. So we have the Hari Raya, which is an Islamic festival that happens at the end of the Ramadan month, and then we also have Chinese New Year, which is the New Year according to the lunar calendar. There's Deepavali, which is the Hindu festival, and there's Gawai and Kaamatan. These are Sabahan and Sarawakian festivals, as well as we also have the New Year celebrations and the Christmas celebrations. We celebrate throughout the year, lots of public holidays. So I think that would put us in a very happy situation. So I would describe Malaysia as a joyful and to a feeling of warmth, I would say. Yeah, because there's lots of celebration and we are very hospitable. We love having tourists and visitors coming into our country. And there's this inclusivity, harmony, and unity. So these are things that we often celebrate together. So definitely joy and warmth. Warmth, of course, the temperature is warm as well, quite literally.
And the joy, from where do you feel joy is coming from?
I think the joy comes from celebration. We tend to celebrate each other's differences because we're living in one country and we all have different cultural backgrounds. And to come together and be able to live as a nation where your neighbors are from different cultural ethnicities and you just tend to just live happily together. So that takes a lot of patience, tolerance, really learning about each other. So yeah, I think there's a lot of joy to be found in that.
So the second question, how did you become a psychotherapist in your country and what is your therapeutic approach?
In Malaysia, you of course need to have your high school education and then move on to getting a degree program, right? A bachelor's, and then you move on to obtaining a master's degree. So you need a master's degree in order to be able to practice as a psychologist and to be able to provide psychotherapy or any therapeutic services. I went through the whole education process and then I got to practice. In terms of my approach, I wouldn't say I stick to one particular approach. I take mainly the client-centered approach. I believe that no one approach fits all. Yeah, so I tend to combine techniques and strategies from various frameworks to best address my clients' unique needs. So I try to keep my approach as flexible and as comprehensive as I can be. So more towards client-centeredness and trying to be as holistic as possible in my practice.
So first you need a bachelor in psychology or can you
Yes.
be a social worker, for example?
You would need a degree in psychology, yes, in order to qualify for the master program.
And in the master program, you have a choice from like clinical psychology,
Yes.
counseling.
Yes. So once you've completed your degree, you can specialize now. You can choose clinical psychology, you can choose to be a counselor, you can even go into educational psychology or developmental psychology. And you can even if you choose not to pursue a master's program, of course, you can't conduct psychotherapy, but there's also a wide range of career opportunities here with just a bachelor's alone, such as HR, business development, and recruitment, and so many other areas.
Where do you get the knowledge from therapeutic approaches? Do you learn in school regarding client-centered therapy, or you go to a special course about that?
It's mainly in your degree and your master's. So the degree covers a lot of the fundamental topics or the foundational skills, such as introduction to clinical psychology, introduction to counseling. So you tend to learn the basics in your degree. And as you specialize, let's say if I choose clinical psychology, like I have, that's where I would get much deeper understanding of all the different approaches. And it also comes with clinical practice. So we have trainings, we'll be sent to different places. It's like a practical training. So you get the theory and the clinical component of it, mainly in your master's, but in the degree program, it's covered as well.
You mentioned in the pre-interview that counseling psychology is more popular than clinical.
Yes, counseling is quite popular in Malaysia because counseling is very well regulated, I would say. We have a government body that regulates the counseling profession. So they sort of had a kickstart in terms of regulation. Clinical psychology came a little bit later. Now we have licensure and registration options under the Ministry of Health. This is something we didn't have probably 5 years ago. So now regulation-wise, clinical psychologists are becoming licensed and registered more frequently now. But yeah, the counseling field is more popular in terms of mental health profession.
And how young is this profession in Malaysia?
In clinical psychology, it's actually been around for a very long time. I think it's been around for at least 2 decades or more. It's just that the number is only now increasing. Yeah. So the number of clinical psychologists are increasing. I would say at roughly around the past 5 years, we've seen a steady increase in clinical psychologists. More and more people are signing up for the master's program in clinical psychology, and therefore we're catering to the demand in the society.
Mm-hmm. You mentioned as well that there is not a lot of psychologists, psychotherapists.
Yes, so that I would say can be a bit of a confusion. We don't really separate psychotherapy from clinical psychology. Yeah. So psychotherapy, we see it here as a service or a therapeutic approach that we provide as psychologists, as a clinical psychologist. So there's really, if you ask me about the distinction between psychotherapy and psychologist, I would say even I can get confused. The difference is, of course, counselors usually are not allowed to diagnose. In Malaysia, diagnosis is mainly done by psychiatrists and clinical psychologists. And then we proceed with the intervention is what we call psychotherapy.
How society looks upon psychotherapy or any psychological help?
I would say the perception of psychological services in Malaysia is evolving. It's reflecting more of the growing awareness in Malaysia, and there's definitely been more acceptance towards mental health care in the recent times, and there are still some challenges and barriers that we have to overcome, but there is definitely increasing awareness. More people are talking about it, more people open to seeking help, and there's more and more government initiatives as well. There's more and more education programs and training being offered. So we now have more clinical psychology programs or counseling programs being opened up. Aside from the government initiatives, we also have non-governmental organizations and private organizations either providing psychological services or just doing psychoeducation to raise awareness. And I think that the COVID-19 pandemic, it's a very important time in Malaysia because that's when the gap was really highlighted between the mental health crisis and how many mental health professionals do we actually have. So that's when the gap between the need to address the crisis was further highlighted. So from then on, I would say more and more psychological services are being offered. I think people also learned a lot about mental health during the COVID pandemic, during the lockdown. There's lots of social isolation, withdrawals, anxiety went up, depression went up. So that's when a lot of people learn this is anxiety, this is depression. And what do I do? And then we started to like cater to those needs. So yeah, I think as a country, we are definitely moving in the right direction. It's becoming better by the day.
And before COVID, what were some challenges?
I wouldn't say it was just before COVID. It's still around, these challenges. Number one definitely is stigma. Just like a lot of other countries, mental health problems are often viewed as a weakness here because we are a collectivistic culture. There's a lot of worry about what would people say if I had this concern, what would my family think. Especially among males, you would see the need to take responsibility over the family, and they often overlook mental health issues as well. So we also have lots of effort here trying to champion male mental health. So stigma is definitely something that we experience. There's also access. Yes, it's growing. We have more services now, but we still have many places where access is still limited. So right now, you'll find the most services in urban areas such as Kuala Lumpur or Penang. These are cities, big cities, where you can easily get different services. But there are still places where there is no mental health professionals at all, especially towards the East Malaysia with Sabah and Sarawak. We see a lot of villages and towns without even a single mental health professional living there. So access is definitely something, but it's improving. I hope one day that every state will have a decent number of psychologists or counselors. Another thing is, of course, cost and insurance. In Malaysia, you would notice that the private psychological services tend to cost more than government services here. So price is something that I've seen a lot of even my clients worry about if it's affordable for them. And of course, the government services are much cheaper. And due to that, we have a long waiting list. Most of our insurance policies here do not cover mental health services. So that's also another concern. So cost is always something that I hear even among my friends, like I need therapy, but I can't afford it. That leads to the shortage problem and the shortage of professionals. It's definitely increasing, like I mentioned just now, but waiting lists still exist. People are still waiting months and months just to get a diagnosis. In Malaysia now, we have about 500 psychiatrists and around 400 clinical psychologists. Yes, and that's to cater for 33 million. Yeah, so Malaysia has actually lesser number of mental health professionals compared to what the WHO recommends. WHO recommends one mental health professional per 10,000 people, but in Malaysia we have less than that. It's about 0.5 psychiatrists per 100,000 people.
And in your opinion, where the mental health service is not available, do you also think there is a difference among population in mental health awareness?
Yes, there is also the access to information that can be limited in the rural areas of Malaysia. Of course, access to information is more readily available when you live in the places. That would then affect awareness towards the need for mental health services and when do I know that I need to seek help.
What is your society teaching about child-parent relationship, and whether this value of society also influence how you design your interventions as a therapist?
Yes, in Malaysia, the society places a very strong emphasis on traditional family values. Of course, now things are getting more modernized. You would also see lots of Western influence here in Malaysia, but we lean still quite heavily towards traditional family values. This is across all the different ethnicities that live here. Among the Malays, the Chinese, the Indians, family values are something that we take very seriously. So it would include notions such as honoring your parents, taking care of them when they've aged. So there's always a sense of responsibility as a child towards your parents. And parents are also viewed as the leaders of the household, the ones who set the structure, the ones who set the routine, the ones who provide for us, the breadwinners. So there is that almost authoritative image of parents here in Malaysia. So these values are, of course, deeply rooted in our own cultural and religious traditions as well. So, like I mentioned, among the Malays, the Chinese, the Indians, even the indigenous community, it also dates back to our initial cultural values, religious values as well. So as for my intervention, I would say the collectivism actually affects my practice quite a lot. So for example, when I'm doing parent support for a Malaysian family, I would not challenge the parents' authority too directly. Encouraging respectful dialogues and understanding is something I find myself doing a lot, since I mentioned that family is often viewed as a whole unit here. But family therapy works really well when you bring in the whole family instead of just the mom and dad. Yeah, so bringing in the kids as well and allowing each member to contribute to a positive change, that helps a lot. So viewing family as a unit is something that I do in my practice. And of course, the cultural sensitivity. So being aware of my client's background and their unique family values.
And you work only with children or also with adults?
Currently, I'm working with children and parents. Yeah, because I'm working at a child developmental center. So I mainly see children, adolescents, teenagers, and parents. Yeah.
So how do they perceive you? If the parents in this position of authority, do the client also see you as authority? Does this translate also to therapy?
Yes, of course. I get that too. Yes, I'm often viewed as a teacher by children because most of them, they don't understand what a therapist does. Rapport building then becomes something that I have to really invest time and effort to break that notion that I am going to tell you what to do. So I have to move past that, break that barrier first before engaging in any therapeutic approach or activity.
What are the learned beliefs regarding client therapist relationship, and can the relationship continue outside the therapy once the therapy process is over?
Just like many other countries, the client-therapist relationship is guided by professional boundaries here as well. We have a clear professional relationship just to make sure that we remain objective, of course, to protect the confidentiality as well as the effectiveness of the therapy program. Building trust, maintaining a non-judgmental behaviors is very important as a therapist. And in Malaysia, I notice cultural sensitivity is also very, very important. Relationships outside of therapy is generally discouraged. So we tend to avoid seeing people with whom we may have a dual relationship with. But there's the awareness towards this can also be limited in many different communities here in Malaysia, because I often get asked by friends and family members like, hey, can I see you for therapy? Can you advise me what I can do? How much do you charge? Can I come and see you? And I often find myself explaining to them about the dual relationship and how it can be unprofessional. As for therapists, as what we are taught in Malaysia is, of course, the professional boundaries set by APA. We have to follow the code of conduct. But in terms of the community, I don't think a lot of people are aware of the code of ethics, of course. So they tend to ask a lot of questions about whether I can see them. And if I say no, they'll be like, oh, how can you not see me? You're a therapist. Yeah. Then I have to explain about the professionalism.
So how much do clients know regarding therapy relationship and boundaries and what it entails?
I would say they don't walk in with all this information with them. We usually take the first session where we do our intake session. That's where we go through all these requirements, like these limitations to confidentiality and professional boundaries that we have to maintain throughout the course of therapy. So this is something that we have to educate or put in front of them in the first session itself, because most of the time they don't know.
Is supervision a must for a therapist in your country?
Yes. During training, when you're doing your master's program, that's where you will have mandatory supervision. So it is a part of your clinical practicums. You will have a supervisor overseeing your clinical practice as a student or a trainee psychologist. And after you've graduated, of course, it's no longer mandatory, but you're highly encouraged to continue receiving supervision for at least the first couple of years until you're able to be completely independent as a full-fledged psychologist or psychotherapist. Yeah.
Is there any law for psychology?
Yes, we currently have the Malaysian Allied Health Act. So that's where clinical psychology is parked under. Counseling also has a law for them. As for psychology, there's no general law governing all the, like for example, educational psychology, developmental psychology, or forensic psychology. We currently don't have laws, regulations for these professions, but we are heading there. The educational psychologists, for example, they are coming together and they're putting together like a society, and they're going to eventually move towards having a government regulation. Yeah, so a lot of the psychology areas is still a work in progress when it comes to laws. But yes, we do have law for counseling as well as clinical psychology for now.
And how people react when you tell them you are a psychologist?
I get very mixed reactions. Some people, of course, the most common thing they say is, "Can you read my mind?" And then I say, I don't read minds, but I can read your behavior. Yeah. So I get that question. And some mistaken me for psychiatrists. So they would say, "Do you see patients in the hospitals?" Yes, I can if I want to, but I think there's a distinction between psychiatrists and clinical psychologists, and that not many people are aware of. I also, if I am going through some anxiety, right, or stress, they'll ask me like, "Aren't you a psychologist? Aren't you supposed to like not have these things?"
What are the most common complaints that a client comes to therapy for?
It's a wide range of complaints. With my experience working with different populations, I see different complaints among different age groups. So maybe with children, mostly what I see is neurodevelopmental disorders like ADHD, autism, specific learning disorders, and there's also anxiety, depression, trauma, and a lot of family relationship related concerns, especially among teenagers. They tend to have a strong reaction towards parental separation and parental divorce. And there's also self-esteem concerns, the ones that they experience before or during puberty. Yeah, so these are concerns that I currently work with among children. With adults, I see more of anxiety and stress, mostly work stress, academic stress, and family relationships. So I think that comes with being in a collectivistic culture. We see lots of family related concerns, and the others as well, like trauma, abuse, marital concerns, work life balance. These are things that I've seen among adults. And with older adults, we see more of those late life depression, neuropsychological concerns, such as vascular dementia or cognitive impairment.
What are some topics regarding child-parent relationships and that concern? So teenage, adult, child,
Yes.
and their parents.
With teenagers and adults, the common theme that I see is expectations, parental expectations. They're expected to achieve certain things, although the parents don't verbalize it. It's like an unspoken rule that you have to make your parents proud. Yes, so I see a lot of the pressure, the anxiety that comes with it, the stress that comes with it, especially among university students, where they're constantly pushing to achieve, and that causes them a lot of stress. Yeah, and with adults, there's the conflicts of interest. When their life goals do not align with the family unit, that tends to cause anxiety and stress as well. But what I see a lot among teenagers is parental separation and divorce, and the mental health consequences that it has on the child.
What are these expectations?
With parents, it varies according to all the different families, but the most basic thing that we tend to expect is for you to have a good job, is for you to have a good salary, for you to maintain the family ties. This is quite commonly you see among the Indian community, where familial relationships and ties cannot be broken. And let's say if your goal is to leave the country or move far away, there is that obligation for you to still check in with your family or to have to maintain that connection even though you're not physically around. So it centers a lot around keeping the family relationship alive and healthy. and fulfilling your responsibilities as a child. And when I say responsibilities, it really varies according to all the different families. Some families you'll notice are more individualistic, where they empower the children to actually move out of home when they reach a certain age. And then you also see families where the children are expected to stay with the parents even after they've gotten married. So it really varies according to different families here.
And what would you say? How is your society open towards displaying emotions, anger, sadness, happiness?
We are very expressive. I see this online as well in social media. People are very vocal about what they feel and think on different topics. But when it comes to mental health issues, I would say there's still a lot of resistance there. Like I mentioned earlier, it's growing, but I wouldn't say 90% of Malaysians are comfortable in speaking about their mental health struggles. There's still a lot of shame attached to admitting that you have a mental health struggle.
And in the pre-interview, you mentioned the attitudes toward diagnosis.
Yes. Yes, I noticed this mainly among parents where they fear the diagnosis of neurodevelopmental disorders. For example, autism, ADHD, but there's an anxiety that comes with it. And I think it's very normal. To a certain degree, it's very normal to be anxious about your child being diagnosed of a neurodevelopmental disorder. I see that the perception towards other adult population, that's where the fear or the stigma towards a clinical diagnosis comes in. So, for example, bipolar disorders, schizophrenia, major depressive disorders, these are viewed as serious mental illnesses in Malaysia. If I were to walk up to someone and I say I have bipolar, they're gonna check some boxes off, like, okay, you're gonna have like mood instabilities, you're gonna yell at me, and it's still attached to a lot of stigma. So oftentimes we see people don't actually disclose their diagnosis easily unless they have to, unless it's for like work purposes, applying for special accommodations, or they will say it to their close family, their close circles. But carrying a diagnosis, there's still a lot of shame attached to it. People don't quite understand that there are differences in severity. So with major depressive disorder, it's a curve. There are people with the milder symptoms and there are people with very severe symptoms. So I think the understanding of the variability across different diagnoses is still very limited here. So you often, if you have a clinical diagnosis, you will experience a bit of anxiety about what you're going to do with it.
And let's say, how does the general population react to someone with diagnosis? So let's say that they know that he or she has diagnosis. How do they respond?
Thankfully, now the people are more open. People are more inclusive towards receiving or even like employing people with ADHD, for example. People are more open and acceptant towards those who are experiencing challenges. But you will still experience this awkwardness. They would want to ask you questions. They would want to ask you, like, if you have major depressive disorder, you probably hear something like, do you cry every day? Like, why are you so sad? What makes you sad? They still don't have detailed understanding of the diagnosis yet, but they're willing to learn. They're acceptant. I would say we're doing much better now. Ever since the COVID-19 pandemic, people are more open towards talking about anxiety and depression. You'll hear about it in our television, you'll hear about it in the radio channels, you'll see it in social media. So it's not something that is completely shut away. It's still being accepted widely.
Mm-hmm. So basically, people approach with questions. They are curious about it because they don't understand yet. Mm-hmm.
Yes, they often ask lots of questions. There's the willingness to learn, and I think that's really amazing. Yeah.
So let's move to the last question. If you would share one tool, belief, or approach that is a must-have for you as a therapist, what would that be?
Being a Malaysian actually influenced a lot of my therapeutic approaches. Of course, because growing up in such a diverse country, I noticed that cultural competence is very, very important if you were to practice here. Even not even just as a psychologist, but any people-related profession, cultural competence is something that I would highly encourage all the therapists to achieve. Even if you're in a different country, I think everybody comes with a different cultural value and background. So understanding unique cultural norms, values, and traditions, making an effort to learn about them. So, for example, in my master's degree, our lecturers actually had us learn about the Malay culture, the Indian culture, the Chinese culture. We also went through some of the religious beliefs that they held. And if you're not able to do that, you can also directly engage in community activities where you can go and meet them and spend time with them and learn about it while also providing your services. Because the cultural values do impact stress levels, relationships, our mental health. It has a role to play in every aspect of our lives, right? So, cultural competence is number one for me. Another thing I would recommend is, of course, try to be as holistic as possible. So, I try to employ a holistic approach. I try to view the person as a whole and integrate all the different areas like the spiritual, physical, mental, emotional, social, view them as a whole person instead of just focusing on the concern alone. We try to address more than just the concern and how all these other areas that I mentioned before might be contributing to that concern, and how if we perhaps support all these other areas, the concern might reduce, just to get a deeper understanding. Viewing the client as a whole is something that I would encourage as well.